Great. So thank you for joining us. Today's session might be slightly shorter than previous ones. I have to move on to something else before 1 o'clock. So welcome again and thanks for joining. This is session number 5. And today we're going to cover some material around the journal submission process, in particular looking at response letters that we can write to referees who look at papers, and some of the challenges and tips around that. I'm also keen for people to, if you recall, to keep filling in this Google Doc spreadsheet, which is the links listed here, and use that to list out any questions that you might have. We're going to cover those in session 6. I'm going to go through each of the questions. I'm just going to copy that into the chat. I'm going to go through each of the questions in that document and ensure that we've covered off on all of the questions that are in there. So if you do have questions that are not quite being answered by material I'm covering, please do add your question into that document, and then we'll make sure that that document is covered. So let me share the screen again. Great, hopefully you can see everything here. So today, let's get right into it, continuing from where we left off in the last session. And this perhaps is one of the questions that many people pretty much universally face when thinking about submitting a paper. Maybe it's the first time you've submitted a paper, maybe you've done a few, but this question probably pops up every time. How good does my paper have to be? And often when we're preparing scientific manuscripts, perfectionism can be our greatest enemy. Often we want the papers that we write to be as good as possible, as good as humanly possible, and sometimes superhumanly possible before we're prepared to submit them to a journal for someone else to see them. And I would argue that that is a cause of many problems for us. Someone's mentioned you can't hear my voice clearly. Thank you for raising that. I'm not sure what I can do. If I speak a bit louder, is that better? Is that better if I speak a bit more loudly? I'm in a different place today, that's why my setup's a bit different. Yeah, okay, so a few people are saying they can hear, so I'll try to talk clearly and a bit louder, thank you. Okay. So the obvious point here is that often, very often with a paper, with a scientific manuscript, 90% is good enough. Now that may sound a very strange thing to say. Surely your paper should be as good as possible before you consider sending it to a journal. And there's several reasons why I would argue that's not the case, and that 90% is good enough. And that when you reach 90%, you should put it on someone else's desk for them to take a look while you start working on something else. And I would argue this is a much more efficient way of doing science and creating productivity over many years. Let me try and describe this, since we're all scientists, with a graph. So take a look at the curves on these axes here. On the x-axis, time you spent working on your manuscript. On the y, your chance of being accepted by the journal to which you send your manuscript to. Take a look at that blue curve first. In most cases, you're submitting to a normal journal, let's call it that. A disciplinary journal, could be a discipline leading journal, could be a regional or discipline specific journal of some kind. But most of your normal journal paper submissions, your chance of being accepted goes up dramatically, of course, initially, but then there's diminishing returns on your effort that you spend working on that manuscript. So as time goes by, the more and more time you spend, yes, your paper will improve slightly. You can see that curve increasing slightly, but really it's reached an asymptote. And the effort that you put in to make your manuscript better is making a smaller and smaller addition to your chance of that paper being accepted. This really means that we have to be careful about perfectionism when we think about creating our manuscripts and submitting them to journals. Yes, you could make it better if you spend another 5 days working on your manuscript, but if that increases your chance of success of publication by 0.1%, it's not worth it. You should be working on a different manuscript instead. Submit that one and start working on a different manuscript, right? And for the most part, I would argue that you've got to try to think fairly explicitly about this. Is my manuscript improving significantly with each round of revisions? Either revisions that you're doing yourself or those that you're getting from co-authors, as we spoke about last time. Is your paper really getting better each time, or are you just making tiny changes and almost just changing things backwards and forwards as the revisions go on? Some people have, I think, a psychological barrier that they're worried about submitting the paper to a journal, that it, you know, once they've submitted it, you can't grab it back, you can't make any more changes, you're exposing yourself to be judged by the scientific community. And we spoke a lot in the first few sessions of this series about that judgment and the criticism that you're going to face when you get your manuscript reviewed. And I think that can be a significant psychological barrier, especially early in our career. I experienced this to a very great extent early in my career, the kind of fear of submitting papers to journals, in part because I was worried about receiving the criticism and knowing in my heart of hearts that it's not perfect. Of course, it can never be perfect. It's got better and better as you spent more time working on it, but now your investment is giving you less return each additional hour that you're spending on the manuscript. Can someone let me know if you can hear me still well? Is that working okay still? Yes, thanks very much. Thank you. Great. Now, check out the green line on this plot. I mentioned that for a normal journal, there's going to be a rapidly diminishing return for the amount of time additional that you spend working on your manuscript. This calculation is slightly different when one's trying for different journals. If you're aiming high, and I mentioned in the last session, you won't be aiming for Nature and Science and PNAS all the time. And this series about scientific writing is not about simply just publishing in Nature, Science and PNAS and those other multidisciplinary journals. But let's say this is your 1 in 20 paper where you think, right, this is a big discovery. I'm trying for a high impact journal and I want to get this right. Now, let me say a couple of things about publishing in high impact journals. We mentioned before that just because you have a paper in Nature doesn't mean it's a good paper, right? Nature and Science papers are not necessarily any better than other papers, but they have a hugely disproportionate impact on your potential career success. And it's really hard to overstate that. Universities and other institutions are ranked in large part, or at least in part, by publications in these kinds of journals. Employers, academic employers, rate publications in these sorts of journals extremely highly, and getting a first author paper in a journal like this can have a huge impact on your future career trajectory and success. So the first thing I want to say, and it may sound perverse, is take it really seriously if you're attempting to submit to a journal like this. That may sound a strange thing to say, But I've actually seen a few circumstances where people have been perhaps almost too casual when trying to publish in journals like Nature, Science and PNAS. And perhaps the reason for this is that they're applying the blue curve when in fact you should be applying the green curve on this plot. The stakes are much higher. The competition is much higher. The standard of papers that are being juggled between and decided between is very much higher for editors at Nature and Science and PNAS and other journals like that compared to regular discipline level journals. This means your paper has to be that bit better than the others to stand a chance of going for review and passing through review. If you review a paper for Nature or Science or PNAS, these top-tier journals, you apply higher standards to that review. You want to see everything spot on and correct and solid and watertight. If you see mistakes, it makes you worry and wonder about the quality of the science. You want to see it really, really tight. You want to be impressed and blown away when you read through that manuscript that you're reviewing for those journals. So I would argue the shape of the curve of the reward, the return on investment looks a bit different. And this implies, well, there's two things. First of all, your chance of being accepted is ever so much lower anyway. I've underestimated the difference really in this plot here. So your chance of acceptance is lower. That means every small increase you can get in your chance of being accepted is worth it. I would also argue that because those differences are much smaller, this curve is taking much longer to asymptote. It's going to take a lot more time to get a manuscript ready for a journal like Nature or Science or PNAS than it would do in a regular discipline-specific or regional journal. So be prepared for that, I think, when you embark on a journey of attempting to submit a paper to one of these very high impact journals. You've got to take it seriously. You've got to be prepared to put the time in, and your calculation of when a paper is ready might be slightly different and you may need longer. I once calculated that a paper that I published in Nature a number of years ago took 7 hours of work per word of the resulting paper by all the people involved in that manuscript. Huge amounts of work, ridiculous, utterly ridiculous amounts of work, but the effort was completely worth it because I think these sorts of papers can be career making if you can nail them. That also reinforces the point that you should be choosing carefully when you make a tilt for these big journals. Don't do it every time. Don't do it indiscriminately. You're wasting your own time if you attempt at these journals with results and data and papers that are just not going to make it. So I'd advise you to take careful advice from those around you. Do I have a realistic shot at Nature, Science and PNAS? If I do, then I'm going to go for it and I'm going to put in the effort over a long period of time to get this paper into a state that it needs to be to stand a good chance. Okay, so I think your level of perfection needs to be tailored according to the journal that you're aiming for, and your degree of patience and commitment to your time commitment needs to be also tailored according to the journal one is going for. Does anyone have any questions on that topic at the moment? Okay. All right. So let's say now you've followed everything we've talked about in the last 5 sessions, you've written your paper, you've carefully judged how good your paper needs to be. You've put in the appropriate amount of effort. You're now ready. You've completed your paper. You're ready to submit your paper to a journal. People suddenly realise two things normally at the end of preparing a manuscript. The first one is, oh, I need to write an abstract. As I mentioned right at the beginning of this, don't do that. Don't make that mistake. Write your abstract very near the beginning of preparing your paper. Don't suddenly write it at the last minute as an afterthought. So make space for your abstract, get it in there early as you're building your paper, and use that as a way of structuring your thoughts. Remember, we spoke about writing a nature bold paragraph for your paper to help you structure your thoughts and your angle and work out what your main results are and why they're important. You know, writing an abstract as an integral part of preparing your paper is important. So don't leave that till the last minute. So assuming you haven't done that, one thing that probably will be done fairly late in the process is writing a cover letter. Now, what's a cover letter? Well, when you submit your paper to a journal, most journals also require that you write a letter to the editor that says, you know, here's my paper, please consider it. I think it's really important because of X, Y, Z. And I think it will be of interest to these kinds of readers. Here's why I think your journal is the best place for this manuscript. And cover letters can be incredibly important. Some editors read them, some editors don't. I have to say, I never paid that much attention to them when I was in editorial roles that I've been involved with. I would focus on the manuscript itself. I think that situation is different for some other editors and also for some journals. It's extremely important for high impact journals. The cover letter is a really important part of it. They're short of time. They really want to focus on authors who know what they've discovered and they know why it's important, and they can sell it quickly in a short covering letter. So in many cases, the cover letter is used as a rapid way of judging the quality of a submission to a journal. So again, take it seriously. I've already mentioned that a cover letter, you might start thinking about that quite late in the manuscript preparation process, but I encourage you to give it the time it needs to get it right. If that means delaying your submission by another week or two, then so be it, right? You want to get it right. And again, especially if you're trying for the highest impact journals. In those cases, I would be advising you to start drafting your cover letter, you know, at least a month before your projected submission date, and having all of your co-authors look at it carefully and give you advice, asking people who've published in the journal that you're aiming for to have a look at it, and really asking for a wide range of feedback. Remember that journal editors are generalists. They're very good at spotting good science, but they're not specialists. They cannot be specialists in all areas of the journals that they cover. And that's especially true, of course, for the multidisciplinary higher impact journals. Those editors are awesome people, but they're not specialists in everything. So you've really got to use your cover letter as a way of showing how generally important and impactful your findings are. And that needs to be communicated to someone who is a smart person, but is well outside, maybe well outside your particular discipline. This makes it a bit different from the material that's actually in the manuscript itself. For example, you can't just grab half the abstract, paste it in the cover letter and send it off, right? You've got to craft the cover letter differently. It has a different purpose. Of course, you'll be taking ideas from the abstract and from other parts of your paper, but you'll be articulating them in a very particular way. First of all, make your cover letter short. Time is incredibly precious for editors, and that's especially true for those very general chief editors who are initially screening manuscripts as they come through the door. Their time is very short. If you write a 16-page cover letter, in a sense, that's an insult to the amount of time that they have available to evaluate your manuscript. So treat them with respect. Write them a short cover letter that enables them to make a judgment about your paper quickly. That respects their time. You've got to show why your paper is important. What big issue, what urgent issue does it address? Does it speak to? You've got to set out something that grabs attention, that is so important that really this is a breakthrough. This is an important discovery, and that you're confident and you know why it's important, and you can articulate what you have discovered and how it moves things on. It may move on a scientific field, it may move on an area of practice or of policy, but you need to be able to articulate why your paper is important. And you've got to grab attention. And you can be unconventional. You can grab the attention of an editor in a range of ways. In the highest impact journals, editors are also thinking about, they're thinking about their readership. In part, it's where science meets journalism. They want a story that is interesting and exciting for the readers of that journal. Again, imagine yourself sitting around in the coffee room, you pick up an issue of Nature and you start leafing through it. You can't be a specialist in all those areas, but you want to read a selection of papers through there that you can see are important and that you can see have made important and exciting discoveries. So try to grab the attention of the editor and convince them that your paper will be widely read, even by non-specialists and by people across a number of different scientific disciplines, and potentially people beyond science, perhaps those who are implementing policies or developing technologies. Will it be interesting for people beyond science? Many journals have blogs, they have media feeds, social media feeds, media releases, the whole works. Journals are interested in broad front communication, not just detailed science. Your science goes in your paper. Your cover letter is a chance to say why and demonstrate why your science is important and interesting. Another thing that often gets forgotten is why now? If you can convey a sense of urgency, is there some event that's happening or some recent discovery which makes, recent development which makes your discovery possible for the first time? Is there a big unanswered question that you've answered, and that now means that lots of additional pieces of science and research can happen? Why now? Why is it important now that this journal publishes this work right now? As you know, many of the highest impact journals have the shortest turnaround times for papers. They want to publish work that has immediate relevance, often to things that are happening in the world, and part of the reason they have high impact factors and lots of citations of their papers is the rapid turnover and the sort of publication of new material that refers to current material. So pay attention to convincing the editor why your paper needs to be published right now and not in a year or two's time. Okay. Anything else on cover letters? Anybody have questions on cover letters before I move on from that topic? Judy has a hand up. I don't know if that was from a while ago. That sounds like it's from a while ago. Okay, we'll move on. So you've submitted your paper to a journal. You've, I don't know, celebrated or at least just gone home with relief and at least that thing's off your desk. Yeah, you can start working on something else while you wait for the journal to evaluate your paper. Of course, there's a number of outcomes that can happen. Another horrible feature of the highest impact journals is that you will get an answer incredibly quickly if the answer is no, an outright no. I've seen rejections happen inside 3 hours for Nature and Science in the past. So that's not pleasant. If that happens, just take some time out and have a bit of R&R and take some time away from it. If all goes well, and of course those desktop rejections are increasingly happening in all sorts of journals now. Many journals are having far more submissions than they can publish and are having to reject large amounts of papers even before sending them for review. So if you get your paper back quickly as a desktop rejection, I don't know, try not to take it too much to heart. Utilize your psychological defenses, talk to those around you, commiserate with them, reassure each other that what you've done is good work and figure out what to do next. Assuming things have gone well, your paper will be sent for review. And if that happens, you will be waiting a bit longer. Again, in the higher impact journals, you might be waiting around a month before you get any comments back. For other journals, it could be a month, it could be 3 months, it can be 6 months. It's incredibly variable. People often ask, should I start chasing the journal? When should I start chasing the journal? There's no kind of single answer to this. It depends on the journal in question. By and large, I would think after around 3 months for most journals, that's starting to appear like quite a long time to me. One thing you can do, you might be worried that if I chase the journal, does it make me look bad? Does it affect my chance of the paper being accepted or not? Short answer, no, it doesn't at all. As long as you do it politely and as long as you do it after a reasonable period of time has elapsed. So don't send a follow-up the next day. 3 months plus, I think, is appropriate. And you can just check in politely and just ask about the status of your manuscript. Of course, you'll be able to log in to the manuscript submission system and you'll be able to see the status of your paper, and that might give you some ideas as to whether things are changing or not and who's waiting on who. Often your inquiry will go to an administrative office. It won't necessarily go to the academic editor handling the paper, and it won't really annoy them. I mean, you know, editors are academics as well. They want their papers published in a timely manner, and you know, you deserve an answer, whatever that answer is, in a reasonable period of time. So don't be shy. If it's been a long delay, then do send an inquiry. So let's imagine that all this has gone through. One day you check your email and then you know, the bombshell hits, you have the answer from the journal. We covered in the first session of this, you know, that often rejections happen, so on and so forth. And we can talk a bit later and in the next session about dealing with that and strategies for that. I want to speak a bit at the moment about responding to reviewer comments. So if all has gone well, basically you'll almost never have a paper waved straight through and accepted without changes. So if you're asked to make changes to your manuscript, don't be disheartened. That is the case in literally 99% of submissions. You'll be asked to make changes to the manuscript. Of course, the magnitude of changes you're asked to make can vary enormously, and sometimes, often, increasingly often, journals will reject papers and say, we don't want to publish your paper, but if you want to consider these reviewer comments and revise your paper, we might consider publishing it. So a decision ranges from that right through to, oh, I'll just make a few minor changes and send it back to us in 3 weeks. So the magnitude of revisions varies a lot. The one common thread, of course, is that you need to make changes to your manuscript. So you need to submit a revision of your manuscript, and you need to respond to the reviewers and the editors that have made comments on your manuscript. Now, this is an area where I think there is a great deal of art to it. It's a very human exercise, right? Some other human beings have criticised your manuscript, and the journal has invited you to revise your manuscript and respond to those criticisms. Depending what the criticisms are, when you first read through the reviewer comments, you will feel probably a roller coaster of emotions. You might be over the moon if they've begun by saying this is an important piece of work. You may be crushed when they point out some things which they believe are flaws. You might be angry if you think they've said something out of order or misinterpreted something that you've done. You'll experience a whole range of emotions. The first thing is read them, understand them, think about them. Don't write a response straight away. Put it in the drawer, give it time. You need to calm yourself down, I think, from the energy, the sort of emotional energy and the hit of getting the comments back and seeing them. You might be disheartened about how much has been requested. Sometimes, you know, the reviewer reports are as long or longer than the paper itself. It can be a disheartening moment when you see all of these. You might be worried that some of the issues raised by reviewers are simply not addressable and can't be changed. And you might be worried about that. You might be angry or upset about things the reviewers have written. So you've got to calm yourself down. You've got to put some distance and some objectivity between you and those comments. This is especially difficult earlier in your career, I think. As you move through your career, you may be reassured to know, at least that I've found, and I think many around me have found, it gets easier, you develop a thicker skin, you kind of get used to the, you know, the way the battles go. And you get used to playing the game. Early on, it can be very difficult. I mentioned earlier in this series that my first ever paper was rejected 5 times from 5 different journals, and I was ready to give up on science altogether. And it was a very difficult process to deal with and to go through. So build the support networks that you need to help you. It's a serious business. It can affect you psychologically, and it's important that you're ready for that and aware of how deeply some of these things can affect people. So reach out to those around you, especially those who've been through it before, and you know, recognise that this process can be difficult. Okay. So you've put some distance between yourself and the comments. You've maybe had a rant to your office mates, whatever. You've kind of put some distance. You've sent it around your co-authors. You've begun to formulate a response or a strategy for revising your manuscript and responding to reviewers. And here's a few lessons I've learned, I think, over the years in responding to reviewer comments. First and foremost, be polite and respectful. This can be really difficult to do, especially if you perceive, and it may just be a perception, that the reviewer has been impolite or disrespectful. As I mentioned in previous sessions, unfortunately, it does happen. It happens rather too much, and I wish we could stamp it out, but it still happens where inappropriate reviewer comments are not rescinded by the editor and are sent through to authors. I think that's poor practice from the editor, but it does sometimes happen. And the second part of this is that you may perceive impoliteness or lack of respect when that was not intended by the reviewer. So in either case, your task, as difficult as it may be, is to hold your tongue and try to be as polite and respectful as possible in your response to the reviewers. It sounds basic, maybe it sounds like I'm being patronising. I hope not. It's a really important yardstick. Being rude or excessively argumentative is not really going to help your prospects of being published. And there's no need to spread impoliteness or disrespect just because we happen to have received some. Secondly, be very thorough. Don't leave anything out, not a single thing. Every single component of each comment made by reviewers, you need to think about it, and you need to do something in your manuscript, and you need to respond to it. Don't leave anything out. There may be something you think, oh, that's a bit difficult. It's quite minor. Maybe I can just kind of merge that in with another comment and just kind of not really respond to it. Don't do that. Be thorough, cover everything that's in there. Thirdly, be honest in your response to reviewers. And I mean that in all its levels, right? Honest about limitations in your work. Honesty about reasons why something perhaps cannot be done in the way a reviewer wants, or honest in if you disagree with the request that an editor or a reviewer has made. But be honest. Don't try to cover anything up or to pull the wool over the eyes of reviewers or editors. Just say things how they are. If you think that doesn't look good, well, change how they are and still be honest. Be brief, if you can, in responses to individual reviewer comments. What I tend to do when I receive comments from referees is kind of cut all of the comments up into individual sort of particles of comment, and then divide those up and respond to each of those. But make your responses as brief as you possibly can. And this is important for several reasons. First, it comes back to the time commitment that editors and reviewers are putting in. Remember, the reviewer has taken hours out of their day to read your paper and provide comments on it. So, you know, they've invested. They don't necessarily want to see 300-word responses to every single comment that they've made. So make your responses brief out of respect for the editor and the referees. Another reason to make your responses brief is that what you don't want to do is open up, you don't want to open up further discussion when you respond to referees' comments. What you really want to do strategically is close it down. You want to change something in your manuscript, address the comment, close it down, move on to the next one. You don't want to start debates or respond to debates and start a kind of back and forth discussion in your review document. This is really important because this can make the difference between being accepted and being rejected. If an editor perceives that there's clearly a very detailed to and fro going on, they may decide that this is just unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. Try to close down each comment. Reduce, don't ignore it, but reduce it to its core. Make a change that addresses the core part of the comment. Briefly describe your change and close down that particular comment. Sometimes you may be asked to do something that you don't really want to do. They might say, can you cite this paper here? And maybe you don't really want to cite that paper there, right? But unless there's some absolutely overwhelmingly important reason why you cannot do that, maybe consider just doing it anyway, rather than starting a big argument about whether or not you should cite that paper right there, okay? Which leads to the last point. You've got to choose your battles carefully, I think. Don't fight everything that you might initially disagree with. Part of this comes back to putting distance between yourself and the comments. If you put a bit of distance, you might think, you know what, it doesn't matter that much. I'll change that word. I can live with that. I'm not going to die in a ditch over that word. I'm actually going to push back on this comment over here, and I want to keep my powder dry for that. Don't fight minor stuff. Fight the important stuff. And when you do fight, fight very politely and firmly and briefly. Someone's made a really asked a really useful question. What if a change that a reviewer wants to see just cannot be changed? So for example, you may have done a questionnaire or an experiment under very specific circumstances or field work in a remote place. You can't go back and collect more data or increase your sample size or collect different variables. It's gone, it's done. You have no opportunity of doing that. Clearly, in those kinds of cases, you have no choice. And it comes back to bullet point number 3 on this list. Be honest about that. Be open about that. You know what? We cannot change it. But can you turn it? Can you still turn that on its head and close down that issue? What can you do in your manuscript? Well, maybe you can talk about limited generalizability as a result of not having data on X, or with your sample size being less than that might be ideal. You can acknowledge that concern that the reviewer had, and don't just acknowledge it to them in your response, but add something into the manuscript. It's really important that for every comment that you're given, you actually change something in the manuscript. Don't just argue back to the reviewer itself in the context of that private discussion. Change something in the manuscript. Remember, these are comments aimed at your manuscript. So the manuscript should be the focus of the discussion. So you might say, we agree, we've made the following 3 changes in the manuscript and trust this addresses the reviewer's concern, right? So you're doing something practical to address it. You're not just arguing with the reviewer. Someone else asks, should you thank referees? That's another good question. Sometimes response documents get completely full up of things like, thank you for that wonderful suggestion. You're a genius. Thank you for spotting that. I would argue that Okay, I didn't mean you're a genius, so you probably are a genius, but I was thinking, you know, often this is what it comes across as, a bit too sycophantic. My suggestion is you do need to use, flattery is a useful tool to use, but use it sparingly. Use it for particularly insightful comments that a reviewer has made. And you can include thanks high up, you know, near the start of your response to a particular reviewer or editor, and certainly in your cover letter when you resubmit the paper. So yeah, do use thanks. I mean, I think thanks is good, but I agree with Kay's point that if the response document just gets totally full up with that stuff, you're really then failing on bullet point number 4 here about being brief, and you're just kind of taking up unnecessary space. And after a point, it's going to start to look a little bit, it's going to start to make you look weak, I think, by sort of constantly kowtowing to the referees and saying thanks for everything. So use it sparingly, use it politely, use it genuinely. Okay. And at the risk of repeating myself, I want to reiterate, change something in the manuscript in response to every comment. Don't start discussions with reviewers about comments. Make a change in the manuscript and tell the reviewer what you've changed in response to their comment. That keeps the discussion focused on the manuscript itself, not on an argument between you and the reviewer. It depersonalizes. I should have added that as another bullet point here. It depersonalizes that discussion that's going on. You want to talk about the manuscript, not arguing with the person who is the reviewer, right? So treat the comment as a comment and talk about what you've changed in the manuscript, or if you've decided not to change something, describing why you haven't changed it, and so on. On that last point of whether you should, you know, when you choose your battles, I don't think I'm not sure I've ever seen a comment where there's nothing you can do in the manuscript itself. There's always something you can do. Even if you can't increase your sample size, you can talk about your sample size in the discussion, right? And you can explain about the sample size in the methods if there was some constraint around what your sample size was, right? There's always something you can say. So my advice is never to flatly object and reject a comment by a reviewer. Try to do something. You can allude to the issue that the reviewer has raised somehow in the discussion. It may be if they've misunderstood something in your manuscript, that you can rephrase what you wrote. If they misunderstood it, that's your mistake, it's not theirs. And it's really important to remember that. There's been a misunderstanding. That means you weren't clear enough in your writing and in your meaning. So try to dig into that and diagnose how that misunderstanding arose. Can you increase the clarity of the writing that led to that misunderstanding? And of course, use polite terminology here. It's not all that polite to say, clearly the reviewer has misunderstood this point. We've tried to explain it more clearly, right? But it would be very different if you said, we apologise, there appears to have been some confusion here. We actually meant to say this, and we've edited that part of the manuscript to make that clearer, right? So be polite, base everything on something you've done in your change you've made to your manuscript, and communicate that to the reviewer. Okay. I've got some detail on responding to reviewer comments, and I'm going to actually cover that. There's literally only 3 or 4 more slides to go, but it's going to take me a little while to go through those. There's some details that I want to take you through. I'm going to cover those on Friday's session for about the first 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes of that session. Then I'm going to open it up to questions and go through the remaining questions in the Google Doc to make sure that we've covered everything that people wanted to see covered in these sessions. So any further questions arising from what we've talked about so far, fire them into the chat or raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll finish the session in a couple of moments. So thank you very much for joining today. Final session number 6 will be on Friday, same time at 12 o'clock midday Brisbane time. We'll finish off talking about response to reviewers with some examples of real responses and thinking through some of these bullet points, and we'll cover any remaining questions that people have. So think back across all 5 sessions so far and bring any questions you have to the next session or add them in to the Google Doc. So thank you everybody for joining again, and I will end the meeting there. So thank you all.